Hey everyone, welcome back to more Reddit stories. I purchased a remote mountain cabin to get away from my panic attacks. Then my neighbor decided my land had been stolen from his family and launched a one-man war. Illegal gates, forged surveys, and even ambushes. His final spike strip ambush ended up costing my family everything. Let's get right into it. The first story was submitted by user Mountain Guy 87, and it goes like this. I bought the cabin when I was 42, right after the panic attacks had gotten bad enough that my hands would tremble during site inspections. 15 years of designing bridges and highway interchanges had left me with a resume that opened doors and a nervous system that slammed them shut. The property was 23 acres of pine and granite, sitting on a ridge so remote that my cell phone turned into nothing more than a glorified camera the moment I crossed the county line. The place drained every dollar I had saved, but it was worth every penny. The cabin itself was compact, just under 1,500 square feet. The solar array could handle the essentials, and the propane tanks were buried deep enough that the snow couldn't reach them. This was clearly constructed by someone who preferred living off the grid. My wife fell in love with it the instant she laid eyes on it. She had grown up in apartments, always longing for open space and quiet. We spent our first weekend there doing absolutely nothing except sitting on the porch, watching the light shift as it traveled across the valley below. No traffic sounds, no sirens, just wind and birds and the occasional crack of a branch giving way under its own weight. The only way to reach the property was a gravel road that switchbacked up the mountain for 3 miles. The road was private, maintained by an easement agreement that traced back to the 1950s when the ridge had been divided into separate lots. According to the title insurance company, everything was in order. The easement was legal, recorded, and permanent, and I had every right to use that road. I met my neighbor a few weeks after we closed on the property. I was unloading lumber from my truck when I heard the whine of an ATV engine. He came around the bend, doing maybe 30 miles per hour, throwing a spray of gravel and dust. He was in his late 60s, broad through the chest and shoulders with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved with dull tools. He cut the engine about 10 feet from where I was standing and just stared at me for a long moment. "You're the one who bought the old property, huh?" he said. It wasn't a question. I introduced myself and extended my hand, but he didn't return the gesture. "My family owned this ridge," he said. "All of it before the county and the banks got involved." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and mentioned something about it being beautiful country. "My father lost it in '73, he went on. "Tax lien sale. They took everything because he couldn't pay what they claimed he owed. You know what they auctioned off? This land, the entire ridge." I shook my head. $18,000 for 600 acres. He spat into the gravel. "You know what you paid for your 23? "I paid fair market value," I said carefully. "Fair?" he repeated, and let out a laugh with no humor in it. "You people come up here with your city money and your lawyers and think you could just take what belongs to someone else." I told him I had purchased the property legally, that I had the deed and the title insurance, and that everything was recorded with the county. He stared at me for another long moment, then fired up his ATV and drove off without another word. My wife asked me about it that night. I told her he was probably just bitter about the old land sale, and that he would eventually get used to having neighbors. She looked worried, but I convinced her it was nothing. People in rural areas could be territorial, I said. Give it time. I was wrong. The first sign of trouble came 3 months later, in early November. I had been away for the weekend visiting friends. When I came back up the mountain, there was a gate stretched across the road, a heavy steel gate, the kind used for cattle guard, chained shut with a padlock the size of my fist. A sign was zip-tied to the chain. It was hand-painted on plywood in black letters neat enough to have been done with a stencil. Property reclaimed, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Below that, in smaller letters, was a reference to some family estate and a date from 1952. I sat in my truck staring at that gate for a solid 5 minutes, trying to make sense of it. The road was mine. Well, not mine exactly, but I had legal access and the easement was recorded in my deed. You simply couldn't throw up a gate and claim a road that other people had a legal right to use. I got out of the truck and examined the lock. It was new and heavy duty. I had bolt cutters in the toolbox. I was reaching for them when I heard the ATV again. He came up from the other side of the gate, from the direction of his property, and he had clearly been waiting and watching for me to return. He had something in his hand, a folder of some kind, and he was smiling. Problem? He asked. I pointed at the gate. You cannot block this road. I have an easement. Your easement is illegal, he said, and held up the folder. I've got the original survey here from 1952. The real one, before they started altering the maps. This road was always private family access only. I asked to see the survey. He held it up so I could see it through the fence, but didn't hand it over. It looked old. Yellow paper in a plastic sleeve with hand-drawn property lines and annotations I couldn't read from where I was standing. That doesn't override my deed, I said. Your deed is fraudulent, he replied. The county had no right to grant easement access over land they didn't even own. I'm correcting a 70-year-old mistake. I told him I was going to cut the chain, and he told me that would be destruction of property and he would have me arrested. I told him blocking legal access was illegal, and he told me to prove it in court. I cut the chain. I wasn't about to let this man just annex my property. He filed a police report as fast as he could. The county sheriff showed up 2 days later. He was apologetic, almost embarrassed by the situation. He had known the neighbor's family for decades. He took my statement, examined my deed, looked at the gate, and said he would need to speak with the county attorney about it. In the meantime, he suggested I leave the gate situation alone and try to work something out with my neighbor like reasonable adults. I asked him if blocking someone's legal access was a crime. He said it depended on whose access was considered legal, and that it was a civil matter, not a criminal one. He recommended I get a lawyer. I got a lawyer. She looked at my deed, confirmed what I already knew, that I had every legal right to use that road, and she filed for a temporary restraining order to force the gate open while we fought out the property rights in court. The neighbor contested it. His lawyer produced a 1952 survey along with a stack of other documents claiming the modern deeds were all based on fraudulent boundary descriptions. The hearing was set for January. In the meantime, my wife and I were essentially trapped. We could hike out, of course. There was a trail connecting to Forest Service land, but it was 4 miles of steep terrain and wasn't maintained in winter. We couldn't get supplies in. We couldn't get our vehicles out. We were effectively prisoners on our own property. I started digging. If he wanted to fight with documents, I would bury him in them. The county registrar's office was in the basement of the courthouse. The clerk was a woman in her 70s who had worked there for 40 years. She remembered the land subdivision in the 70s, and she remembered the tax lien sale. That family fought it for years, she told me. They claimed the assessment was wrong and that the county had manipulated the values to steal the land. Never got anywhere with it, though. I asked if I could see the original lien documents, and she brought me 3 boxes of files, each one packed with yellowed paper and carbon copies that were barely legible. It took me 6 hours to find what I was looking for. Buried in the 3rd box was a folder labeled Eastman Rights Transfer. Inside was a quitclaim deed from 1973 signed by the neighbor's father, transferring all Eastman access rights for the mountain road to the county in exchange for a reduction of criminal penalties for filing false liens against county property. The father hadn't just lost the land in a tax sale. He had committed fraud trying to fight it, and he had traded away the road access to stay out of jail. I made copies of everything, naturally, but that wasn't all I found. Tucked into a folder marked pending were 3 affidavits, all dated within the last 2 years, all signed by my neighbor. Each one claimed that the property I had purchased had been abandoned by the previous owner, that the county had failed to properly notify anyone of a tax sale, and that the easement had lapsed due to non-use. Every single word was a lie, but the affidavits were notarized and filed with the county. He had been building a paper trail, constructing a false legal foundation to support his claim. He had been planning this for years, probably from the very day the property went up for sale. I brought everything to my lawyer. She was quiet for a long time after she finished reading. "This is fraud," she said finally. "Systematic, premeditated fraud." I asked if it was enough to get the gate opened, and she said it was enough to get him charged criminally, but that it would take time. For now, we would use it at the restraining order hearing. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in January. The judge was a transplant from the city, which my lawyer said was fortunate. The local judges all knew my neighbor's family. We presented the quitclaim deed, the transfer of easement rights, the proof that his father had surrendered any claim to the road. We also presented the fraudulent affidavits, showing how he had been systematically lying to the county for years. The neighbor's lawyer argued that the quitclaim had been signed under duress and was therefore invalid. My lawyer pointed out that regardless of duress, it had been legally recorded for 52 years, and the neighbor had never once challenged it until now. The judge ruled in my favor. Temporary restraining order granted. The gate had to come down within 24 hours. I thought I had won. I drove back up the mountain that night, feeling lighter than I had in months. My wife met me at the cabin door, and I told her it was over, that we had won, that the road would be open by morning. We celebrated with wine on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley purple and gold. Soon after, the gate was gone. In its place was a pile of old tires, maybe 50 of them, stacked across the full width of the road, and beyond that, another heap of scrap metal and broken concrete. He couldn't legally block the road with a gate anymore, so he was blocking it with garbage instead. When I called the sheriff, he said it was illegal dumping and that he would file a report with the county environmental office. When I called the environmental office, they said they would send an inspector within 30 days. I spent 3 days clearing the road myself, hauling the tires and scrap down to a disposal site in the valley. It cost me $600 in dump fees. A week later, he dumped even more. That's when I installed the security cameras. I was tired of having no proof of who was dumping the garbage. Tired of the he said, she said dynamic with the sheriff's department. So I bought 6 motion-activated trail cameras, the kind hunters use, and positioned them along the road. 2 near my property entrance, 2 at the halfway point, and 2 near the S-curve where the road was most exposed. Cheap insurance, I figured. $50 each, and they would give me evidence the next time he pulled something. The cycle continued through February and March. He would dump, I would clear, he would dump again. The cameras caught him every single time, but my lawyer said the footage wasn't sufficient for criminal charges. We would need to catch him in the act with a witness, or he would need to dump enough material to qualify as a felony amount. A few tires here, and there was just a misdemeanor, and the county wasn't interested in prosecuting him. Through all of this, my wife kept asking if we should just sell and leave. The neighbor had made another offer the previous week, slipping an envelope under my truck's windshield wiper while I was in town. I had torn it up. The cabin was supposed to be a refuge, she said, not a battleground. I told her I was not going to let him win, that we had bought this place legally and fairly, and that we had every right to be here. My lawyer said we could return to court for contempt, but the process would take weeks and cost thousands. I was already into this for more money than I care to think about. Then things got worse. I had hired a surveying crew to come up and establish the precise boundary line between my property and his. I wanted zero ambiguity, no room for him to claim I was encroaching on his land. The crew arrived on a Monday morning, 2 guys with a truck full of equipment. They had been working maybe 20 minutes when the neighbor showed up on his ATV. This time he had a shotgun slung across his back. He didn't point it at anyone. He didn't make any verbal threats, but he sat there on his ATV with that gun clearly visible. The surveyors packed up and left within 15 minutes. When I called to find out what happened, the crew chief said he wasn't interested in working on a property with an active dispute. He would refund my deposit and suggested I find someone else. I couldn't find someone else. Every other surveying company I contacted said the same thing once they heard the address. They knew my neighbor, they knew his reputation, and they weren't interested. By this point, it had been many months since I first encountered my neighbor. Months of harassment, legal bills, and escalating confrontation. But he wasn't finished yet. He showed up at my cabin 3 weeks later with another purchase offer. This time he didn't just leave on my truck, though. He knocked on the door and handed me the envelope himself. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. $15,000? That's more than fair. I told him I wasn't selling. "You will eventually," he said, "one way or another." I asked him what that meant. He just smiled and walked back to his ATV. The following 3 weeks were quiet. Suspiciously quiet. No more garbage dumped on the road. No more run-ins at the property line. I told him to stop coming to my property. He just smiled and said I would regret being stubborn. Then came the town council meeting. The neighborhood had petitioned to have the road rezoned as so-called private heritage land, protected under some obscure historical preservation statute. If he succeeded, he would effectively render the Eastman worthless. I would have access to a road that no one was legally permitted to use. The meeting was held in the community center with maybe 30 people present, most of them locals who had lived on the mountain for generations. I was the outsider, the city person who had bought his way into their community. The neighbor gave his presentation first. He talked about his family's history, about the injustice of the tax lien sale, and about the importance of preserving the heritage of the ridge. He had old photographs, newspaper clippings, documents showing his family had worked this land for generations. I'm not going to lie, it was compelling. Even I had to admit that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have been swayed. But then it was my turn. I didn't give a speech. I simply handed out copies of the quitclaim deed, the one where his father had signed away the road rights to avoid criminal prosecution for fraud. The room went very quiet. The council president read the document aloud, every word of it, including the part about the criminal penalties, about the false liens, about the county agreeing not to prosecute in exchange for the Eastman transfer. When he finished, he looked at my neighbor for a long moment. "Is this document authentic?" he asked. My neighbor's face had gone red and then white. That was 50 years ago. My father was under duress. They coerced him. But you never challenged it, the council president said. In 50 years, you never once tried to overturn this deed. I didn't know about it until recently. That was a lie, and I could prove it. I handed the council president copies of the affidavits my neighbor had filed, the ones claiming abandonment and lapsed easements. In each one, he had referenced the 1973 quitclaim, arguing it was invalid. He had known about it all along. The vote wasn't even close. The rezoning petition was denied unanimously. I drove home that night feeling vindicated. Finally, after months of harassment and legal bills and dumped garbage, the law had worked. The system had functioned and justice had been served. My wife was waiting up for me. I told her it was finally over. She hugged me and cried with relief. And yeah, guys, what if I told you this isn't even the halfway point of the story? It's about to take an insane turn. But before we get there, please don't forget to like the video and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. Thank you so much for helping with the YouTube algorithm. Also, let me know if you enjoy these extra long stories. Anyway, 2 days later, the county environmental office sent the neighbor a formal fine for illegal dumping, $1,500. He paid it without complaint. I should have recognized that as a bad sign. A man who had been fighting that hard, who had spent months harassing us, doesn't simply accept defeat and move on. But I was too relieved, too worn out to see what was coming. Since I bought the cabin, he had made 5 separate offers to purchase the property, each one slightly higher than the last, and each one rejected. The pattern was always the same. He would harass me with dumping or threats, then show up with a purchase offer like he was doing me a favor. I had started to see it as a kind of ritual, his way of maintaining the illusion that this was all just a business negotiation. But after the town council meeting, the offers stopped. The harassment stopped. Everything stopped for 3 weeks. It was completely silent. I was wrong to think it was over. I went back to work in early April. My supervisor had been patient, more patient than I probably deserved, but projects were piling up and I couldn't keep taking personal days to deal with property disputes. My wife stayed at the cabin. She had been working remotely for years, and her setup there was just as functional as it had been in the city. We talked every evening. She would tell me about her day, about the deer that wandered through the clearing, about the progress she was making organizing the storage shed. Just normal things. Peaceful things. On Thursday, she drove down to the valley for groceries. We were running low on everything, and the weekend forecast called for snow. She wanted to stock up before the roads deteriorated. I was in a project meeting when she texted that she was heading back up the mountain. The message came through at 4:47 p.m. I sent back a thumbs up emoji and turned my attention back to the drainage calculations on my screen. At 5:23 p.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I was still in the meeting and had learned to ignore the spam calls that came through a dozen times a day. But something made me look twice. The area code was local to the mountain region. I stepped out of the conference room and answered. It was a sheriff's deputy. He said there had been an accident on the mountain road. A vehicle had gone off the curve near mile marker 7. He asked if I owned a vehicle with a specific license plate number. I told him that was my wife's car, and he asked me to come to the scene immediately. The drive from my office to the mountain took 90 minutes under normal conditions. I made it in 70, running lights I shouldn't have run, taking corners faster than was safe. The deputy had been vague about my wife's condition, which I knew meant it was bad. If she had been okay, he would have said so. I found the accident site by following the emergency lights. 3 county sheriff vehicles, an ambulance, a fire truck, and 2 Forest Service trucks. The road was blocked, and they had set up flares along both approaches. A deputy stopped me 50 feet from the scene. I told him who I was. He looked uncomfortable and called someone on his radio. The senior deputy came over and had the expression of someone who had witnessed something he would carry with him for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said. "She didn't make it." The car had gone off the road at the S-curve, the sharpest turn on the entire 3-mile stretch. It had struck a tree about 40 foot down the embankment on the driver's side. The impact had killed her instantly. They said she hadn't suffered. They said that like it was supposed to help, but I was absolutely devastated. I could barely breathe. I asked what had happened, and the deputy said it appeared she had lost control on the curve. The road was gravel, and sometimes vehicles would slide if they came in too fast. I told him my wife had driven that road 100 times. She knew every curve, every rough patch, and she would not have taken that turn too fast. He said it was just an accident. These things happened on mountain roads. After 2 hours of argument, and after the medical examiner had already removed my wife's body, they finally allowed me to approach the scene under the supervision of a deputy. I couldn't touch anything, but I could look. The car was crumpled around the tree like aluminum foil. The entire driver's side was compressed inward. The roof buckled down at an angle that turned my stomach. There was broken glass scattered everywhere, across the leaves and dirt like scattered diamonds. I forced myself to look away from the car and focus on the road. And then I remember the cameras. I had installed a security system 6 months earlier. Motion-activated trail cameras positioned along the road to catch anyone dumping garbage again. One of them was mounted on a tree about 50 feet before the S-curve. The tire tracks were clearly visible on the gravel. She had entered the curve at a normal speed, staying exactly where she should have been. Then about 20 feet before the apex of the turn, the tracks went erratic. Both front tires had veered hard right and then overcorrected left. She had tried to straighten out, but couldn't bring the vehicle back under control. I followed the tracks backward, looking at where they had first gone wrong, and that's when I saw them. They were partially concealed beneath wet leaves and scattered gravel. But once I knew what I was looking for, they were unmistakable. 4 metal strips, each about 6 inches long and an inch wide, with 3-inch spikes welded perpendicular to the base. They were positioned across the road in a zigzag pattern right at the entrance to the curve, exactly where a driver would naturally be focused on the turn ahead rather than the road surface. They were cower-up spike strips, custom-made to puncture tires. I picked one up. The metal was still bright where the welds had been freshly made. The spike tips were sharp and clean. I called the deputy over and showed him what I had found, then told him about the security camera. His expression shifted as he looked at the spike strip, then at the tire tracks, then back at the strip. He called over the senior deputy, and they examined the scene together. We retrieved the SD card from the camera, and the senior deputy had a tablet in his vehicle. We watched the footage right there at the scene. The video showed my wife's car entering the frame at normal speed, around 25 miles per hour, and then the front tires struck something in the leaves and both blew simultaneously. The car lurched hard right. She overcorrected left, and the vehicle went off the road. The timestamp read 5:19 p.m., but there was more. The camera had been triggered 90 minutes earlier at 3:47 p.m. The footage showed someone in a canvas jacket and work boots walking in a frame from the direction of my neighbor's property. They were carrying something, and though the angle made it difficult to see exactly what, The person stopped right where the spiked strips were now, bent down for about 2 minutes, and then scattered leaves and gravel over the area. After that, they walked back the way they had come. The footage was grainy, and the person's face wasn't clearly visible, but you could see the build, the walk, the distinctive canvas jacket. You could also see the boots. Heavy work boots with aggressive tread. This was not an accident, I said. The deputy asked me not to touch anything else. He started making calls, and they kept me there for another 3 hours while they photographed everything, collected the spiked strips as evidence, and took my statement. By the time they let me leave, it was after 10 p.m. They had lit the scene with portable work lights that made everything look stark and unreal. I didn't go home, though. I went to the cabin. I couldn't go inside. Everything in there belonged to both of us. And now there was only me. I sat on the porch in the dark, my hands empty, but still remembering the weight and cold of the spiked strip I had found. The police had bagged all of them as evidence, but I could still picture every detail. The neat welds, the sharp points, the deliberate and careful construction. I hadn't eaten since before the deputy's call, hadn't showered, hadn't changed clothes. The suit I'd worn to work was wrinkled and reeked of sweat and fear. I should have been crying, I thought. I should have been breaking down, screaming, destroying something. But there was just a hollow numbness punctuated by surges of rage so intense my hands shook. I had been awake all night, sitting in the same chair, staring at nothing, when I heard the ATV. At 9:17 a.m. the next morning, the sound of that engine cut through the fog in my head like a blade. I've been sitting in the same position so long that my legs had gone numb. I stood slowly, watching as he drove up to the cabin. He was wearing work boots, heavy jeans, and a canvas jacket, the same jacket from the security footage. He cut the engine about 30 feet away and sat there for a moment looking at me. Then he smiled. "Heard about the accident," he said. "Real shame." I didn't say anything. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. "I know this is a difficult time, but I wanted to give you an opportunity. A property this big, it's a lot for one person to manage. I'm prepared to make you an offer." He held out the paper. It was a purchase contract already filled out with his name as buyer and a price that was maybe 60% of what the property was actually worth. "You don't belong here," he said. "You never did. The mountain took your wife because you tried to claim something that wasn't yours. Now you have a chance to make it right. Sell me the property and leave." I stood up. My voice sounded strange when I spoke, flat and cold. "Did you make those spike strips?" I asked. His smile didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about. They were on the road yesterday, hidden in the leaves right before the S curve." "That's a dangerous curve," he said. "Lots of accidents there over the years." "She hit them and lost control." "If you say so." "The police have them. They're going to analyze them, run forensic tests, and I have security camera footage of someone planting them 90 minutes before she died." For just a second, his smile faltered. Then it came back harder than before. "Then I guess we'll see what they find." He gestured at the contract again. "This offer expires in 72 hours. After that, you'll be on your own up here. No neighbors to help if something happens. No one to check on you if you don't show up in town for a while." And that's when I noticed his boots. Heavy work boots with aggressive tread for traction on rough ground. The tread pattern was distinctive. A series of hexagons within hexagons. And the left boot had a gash across the toe, a cut in the rubber that exposed the lighter material underneath. I had seen that tread pattern before in the mud near where the spiked strips had been hidden. The crime scene photos had captured it clearly. "You should leave," I said. He laughed at me. "This is my mountain, and I'm not going anywhere." He stood up from the ATV and walked toward me, still holding the contract out. "Sign it. Just make this easy on yourself." I told him to get off my property, but he kept coming. "You think you won? You think that meeting changed anything? Your wife is dead because you were too stubborn to leave when you had the chance. I gave you opportunities. 5 different times I offered you a fair price. You refused everyone. This is on you." Something broke inside me then. Not broke exactly, more like a dam failing. All the anger and grief and rage I had been holding back since the deputy's phone call came flooding out at once. I told him to get the hell out. I told him what he had done. I told him I had evidence, that the cameras had captured him, that he was going to prison, and that he would spend the rest of his miserable life in his cell thinking about this mountain he would never see again. He laughed at me. Then he lunged forward and tried to grab my shirt. "You don't have anything. That footage doesn't show my face." Those spike strips could have been planted by anyone. We struggled. He was stronger than I expected and had the advantage of momentum. He shoved me backward, and I stumbled against the porch railing. I had my pistol in my waistband. I carried it sometimes when working outside, mainly because of bears and mountain lions. I had never imagined needing it for anything else. I drew the weapon and told him to back off, but he didn't. He came at me again, his hand reaching for my chest. I thought he was going to shove me over the railing or grab the gun. I thought that if he got control of the weapon, I was dead. So I fired. I was trying to stop him from attacking me, period. But he was moving, lurching forward, and I was off balance from being shoved into the railing. In that split second when I pulled the trigger, everything went wrong. The shot went low and to the right. The bullet caught him in the foot. He went down screaming, clutching his boot as blood began pooling in the dirt. I stood there with the gun still raised, my hands shaking, trying to process what had just happened. He was screaming that I'd shot him, that I was a murderer, that I was going to prison. He was trying to reach for his phone, still screaming. I called the sheriff's department myself and told them there had been a shooting, gave them the address, and said to send an ambulance. Then I sat down on the porch steps, placed the gun on the ground beside me, and waited. The deputies arrived shortly after. 3 vehicles, 6 officers. They had their weapons drawn when they came around the bend, and they ordered me to put my hands up and move away from the gun. I complied with everything they asked. I put my hands up, I moved away from the gun, and I told them exactly what had happened from start to finish. But my neighbor was still screaming. He was telling them that I had attacked him, that he had come to offer condolences, and I had just started shooting. He claimed he was trying to defend himself when I drew the gun. One of the deputies picked up the contract that had fallen during the struggle. He read it, then looked at me, then at my neighbor. "You came here the day after his wife died to try to buy his property?" the deputy asked. My neighbor said he was just trying to help, that I had clearly lost my mind with grief. Another deputy was examining the porch, noting the scuff marks in the dirt where we had struggled. He photographed everything. Then the ambulance arrived. The paramedics loaded my neighbor onto a stretcher. He was still screaming that I was a murderer, that they needed to arrest me, and the deputies told him to be quiet and let the medics work. They took my statement. They photographed the scene, the porch, the ATV, everything. They bagged the gun as evidence and took the contract. Then they put me in handcuffs. "You're being detained for assault with a deadly weapon," the senior deputy said. "You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." He read me the rest of my rights while his partner searched me and placed me in the back of his vehicle. As they drove me down the mountain, I could see the ambulance ahead of us, emergency lights flashing. My neighbor was in there, probably still screaming about being a victim. I had shot a man on my own property in what I believed was self-defense, but I had still shot him. And now I was handcuffed in the back of a police car, facing charges I didn't fully understand yet. The cabin was a crime scene. The property I had fought so hard to keep was now cordoned off with yellow tape and restricted access signs. And my wife was still dead. The deputy driving glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "The detective handling your wife's case wants to talk to you," he said. "About the spike strips. They found footprints at the scene. Distinctive boot tread." I looked out the window at the forest passing by. "The left boot has a cut across the toe," I said. "You'll see in the crime scene photos, and you'll see it on the boots he was wearing today." The deputy was quiet for a moment, then nodded. They took me to the county jail. I was processed, photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell. My lawyer arrived 3 hours later. She looked exhausted and worried. "They're charging you with assault with a deadly weapon," she said. "Possibly even attempted murder, depending on the DA's mood. Your neighbor is claiming you attacked him without provocation." I told her everything. The spike strips, the security footage, the tread pattern on the boots, his implicit confession on my porch, the struggle over the contract, how he had lunged at me and I had fired in self-defense. She took notes and told me not to say anything to anyone else. Then she left to start working on bail. I spent that night in the holding cell, staring at the ceiling and thinking about my wife, about how she had looked the last time I'd seen her, smiling as she left for the grocery store, about how she had never come home, about how the man responsible for her death was lying in a hospital bed right now, playing the victim, trying to get me sent to prison. The next morning, they moved my neighbor from the hospital to the jail. They placed him in medical isolation because of his foot injury, but he was officially under arrest. The detective had compared his boots to the footprints at the accident scene and to the figure in the security camera footage, and they matched. The bail hearing was held on Monday morning. My lawyer argued that I was a professional with no criminal record, that I had called the police myself after the shooting, and that I had cooperated fully with the investigation. The prosecutor argued that I had shot an unarmed man during a property dispute and that I was a flight risk given the severity of the charges. The judge set bail at $50,000. My lawyer arranged for a bail bondsman who accepted a lien on the cabin as collateral, even though it was technically still part of an active crime scene. The process took 2 days and cost me an additional $5,000 in fees, but by Thursday evening, I was released. My neighbor's bail hearing was scheduled for the same afternoon. His lawyer argued that he was the victim of an unprovoked attack and that he was a lifelong resident of the community with deep roots. The prosecutor presented the footprint analysis from the accident scene and stills from the security camera footage showing someone matching the neighbor's build and clothing planting the spike strips. The judge denied bail entirely, citing evidence of premeditated murder and flight risk. We were both out by Thursday evening, but only one of us was wearing an ankle monitor. I was. The detective assigned to my case was a woman in her 50s who had been with the sheriff's department for 23 years. She came to see me in my lawyer's office 2 days after I was released. "I need to ask you about the spike strips," she said. "Walk me through how you found them." I described everything: the tire tracks, the position of the strips in the leaves, the fresh welds and clean metal, the security camera that had captured it all. "Your neighbor is claiming that you planted them," she said. "His lawyer is saying you fabricated them yourself to frame him for your wife's death." Histoire de hair. That is insane. The security camera footage shows someone planting them 90 minutes before my wife died. I was at work, and I have dozens of witnesses. I know, and we verified your alibi. But his lawyer is arguing that you could have planted them earlier, that the footage could have been tampered with, that you had the technical knowledge to create something like this. She pulled out a photo and slid it across the table. "Can you prove that you didn't make these?" The photo showed one of the spike strips in detail, laid out on a clean white surface with a measurement scale beside it. The welds were visible, neat, and professional. "I'm a civil engineer specializing in structural analysis for transportation projects," I said. "I spent 15 years reviewing load calculations, stress distributions, and failure analysis for bridges and highway interchanges. I could tell you exactly how much force it would take to shear a bolt or crack a weld, but I've never actually fabricated anything with my own hands. I don't own welding equipment, and I've never welded anything in my life. I don't even know how to strike an arc, but you would know how to design something like this. Anyone with basic knowledge could design a spike strip. That doesn't mean I made it, and the footage shows that I didn't." The detective leaned back in her chair. "Here's the problem. We have physical evidence that ties your neighbor to the scene. The footprints match his boots. The security footage shows someone matching his description. But we don't yet have physical evidence that ties him to the spike strips themselves. His lawyer is going to argue reasonable doubt. Maybe someone else made them. Maybe you made them." My lawyer spoke up. "What about forensic analysis of the metal? Can you trace where it came from?" The detective nodded. "We're working on that. The metallurgist says it'll take a few weeks, but they should be able to identify the specific type of steel and possibly even the manufacturer and batch. It takes time." She left, and my lawyer told me to be patient. The investigation was ongoing. They were building a case, but it had to be airtight. Murder charges required proof beyond reasonable doubt. I went back to the cabin. It felt wrong being there without my wife. Every room carried some memory of her. The kitchen where she had made coffee every morning. The porch where we had watched sunsets. The bedroom where we had talked about our plans for the property. I couldn't stay inside. I spent most of my time on the porch or walking the property line or just sitting in my truck with the engine running and the heater on. 3 weeks after the shooting, my neighbor filed a civil lawsuit against me from jail. He was suing for the injury to his foot, for emotional distress, for medical expenses. He wanted $200,000 from me. My lawyer said it was a pressure tactic. He was trying to bankrupt me before the criminal trial, trying to force me to accept a plea deal or drop the charges against him. I told her I wasn't dropping anything. The forensic analysis came back in early June. The metallurgist's report was 47 pages long, but the critical portion was on page 12. The spike strips were made from rebar, a specific type of steel reinforcement bar used in concrete construction. The metallurgist's analysis identified it as grade 60 rebar manufactured by a specific mill in the Pacific Northwest. The batch number indicated it had been produced in March of the previous year. The county building supply store kept detailed sales records and had sold exactly one bundle of that specific batch to a customer who had paid with a credit card. The customer was my neighbor. He had purchased it on March 15th, along with welding rods and cutting discs for an angle grinder. The receipt was in the evidence file. His lawyer tried to argue that buying rebar didn't prove he had made the spike strips. Plenty of people bought construction materials. He could have used it for any number of projects. But then the search warrant results came back. The sheriff's department had executed a search warrant on my neighbor's property the day after his arrest. They had found a metalworking shop in one of his outbuildings. Inside was a cutting torch, a welder, an angle grinder, and a workbench covered in metal shavings. The metal shavings were tested. The lab found multiple types of metal present, but among them were shavings that matched the composition and batch characteristics of the rebar used in the spike strips. It wasn't a perfect match. There was other metal debris mixed in from various projects, but the metallurgist testified that the probability of that specific batch being present by coincidence was extremely low. They also found additional evidence that what my neighbor had done was premeditated. The charges against my neighbor were then upgraded. First-degree murder, attempted murder, conspiracy against me, illegal road obstruction, fraud, filing false affidavits, assault during our confrontation on my porch. The list went on and on. The trial was scheduled for September, 14 months after my wife's death, and nearly 2 years to the day after I had first encountered my neighbor. 2 years of escalating harassment, legal battles, and terror that had culminated in murder. My own charges were still pending: assault with a deadly weapon. My lawyer was negotiating with the prosecutor, arguing self-defense, but the DA wasn't ready to drop it entirely. We would have to wait and see how the murder trial played out. I spent the summer doing what I had moved to the mountain to do in the first place. I worked on the cabin, fixed the roof, replaced some damaged siding, repaired the solar panel mounts. I hiked the property, memorizing every tree and rock and stream. I scattered my wife's ashes in the clearing behind the cabin, the spot where she had always wanted to plant a garden. I said goodbye to her there, alone in the quiet, with nothing but the wind and the birds to hear me. The trial began later. The courthouse was packed. I sat through every day of testimony. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically. The security camera footage showing the spike strips being placed. The footprints at the scene matching my neighbor's distinctive boots. The rebar purchase. The metal shavings in his shop. The notebook entries. The documented pattern of harassment over 18 months. And my work alibi, proving I couldn't have planted the strips myself. The medical examiner testified about my wife's injuries, about how the sudden loss of tire pressure from the spike strips would have made the vehicle impossible to control on that curve. An accident reconstruction specialist presented computer simulations of the crash, demonstrating how the punctured tires had caused the vehicle to veer off the road. The defense lawyer tried to manufacture reasonable doubt. He argued that the security footage was too grainy to definitively identify his client. He brought in character witnesses who testified about my neighbor's standing in the community, about his family's long history on the mountain. But it didn't matter. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman looked tired and grim. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, attempted murder, fraud, illegal obstruction, assault. The list went on. Sentencing was scheduled for later. I didn't attend. My lawyer informed me of the outcome. He received 25 years to life for the murder conviction. Consecutive sentences on the other charges brought the total to a minimum of 38 years before parole eligibility. At his age, it was effectively a life sentence. He would die in prison, just as I told him he would. A week after his sentencing, the prosecutor dropped the charges against me as well. The shooting was ruled justifiable self-defense. I had been on my own property, confronted by a man I had reasonable cause to believe posed an immediate threat based on the evidence of what he had done to my wife, and I had used force to stop that threat when he physically attacked me. The fact that the shot hit his foot rather than center mass actually supported my claim. It demonstrated I wasn't trying to execute him, only stop the attack. The civil lawsuit disappeared with it. His lawyer withdrew the complaint the same day. I stayed at the cabin through the winter. It was hard being there alone, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. This was the place my wife had loved, the refuge we had built together. Selling it would have felt like admitting he had won. I learned that my neighbor's family had moved away. They had put his property up for sale, but there were no buyers. Nobody wanted land with that kind of history attached to it. Eventually, the bank foreclosed on it. The property went to auction. I won in the end. The law worked. Justice was served. But the cost was everything. I had moved to the mountain to protect my peace, my marriage, and my belief that doing the right thing would be enough. And now, let's read the fantastic petty revenge story titled, "A Customer Called Me Stupid, so I made sure he would never be able to return his purchase." I've worked retail for 3 years, and you develop a thick skin, but sometimes someone manages to get under it. This guy comes in the other day, middle-aged, already irritated before I even opened my mouth. He wanted a specific speaker that was on sale, and unfortunately we were sold out. I told him I could check other store locations or order it online for him at the same price. Perfectly reasonable options, right? He goes, "Are you stupid? Just check the back. Non verbatim." I smiled, said I would check, walked to the back, stood there for 3 minutes, came back out and said, "Sorry, sir, we don't have any." He ended up buying a different speaker, a more expensive one. His loss, I suppose. One thing about our return policy is that it requires a receipt. You can do it without one, but it becomes a whole ordeal. Manager approval, store credit only, real pain in the rear. So when I bagged a speaker, I folded the receipt as small as it would go. Then I taped the bag shut. Then I placed that bag inside another bag and taped that one shut too, tucking the receipt right between the layers where the tape meets the plastic. If he ever tries to return that speaker, he will have to destroy both bags just to find it. And even then, there's a tiny crumpled square wedged in tape residue waiting for him. Will it ruin his life? No. Will it mildly inconvenience him at the exact moment he's already frustrated about returning something? Absolutely. Enjoy your speakers, sir. And yeah, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the extra long story.